Hello, everybody. My name is Ilan Stavans. It's a pleasure to see you all, and it's particularly a pleasure to see you, Dan Brown, who is joining us directly from Costa Rica. Looking forward to the conversation. I want to start by introducing this as part of a larger series. We are in a season of Point Counterpoint. Program that started in 2016 as a result of the isolation that some of us felt in the academic environment in the presidential election that took place, and the feeling that the country was moving in that one direction and that bubbles like Amherst and other campuses were not quite synchronized with with what was happening in the world. The class of 1970, to whom we owe the funding for the previous installments and this one, proposed the idea of bringing to campus folks that have very different ideological, religious, social, cultural views that would inform the student body and the faculty, the administration, and the public at large, and allow us to live not in an echo chamber, but connected with others that think unlike us. This season, Point Counterpoint, is devoted to the theme of the democracy and the American language. To what extent, in a very fractured, a fragile moment in American history, it is the language that we use that can still bring us together, folks of different persuasions, folks of different political opinions. And for that, we have had the former president and publisher of the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. We have had the New York Times columnist John McWhorter. And today we have best-selling author and Amherst alum, class of 1986, Dan Brown. Such a pleasure to have you here. Before I go on, I want to remind everybody that we have two more events coming up. One is I have it written here, on the April 18. It will be in person with the Ukrainian-American poet Ilya Kaminsky, and on October 25th, also in person at Stern Auditorium with a Japanese-American novelist and Zen Buddhist priest, Ruth Oseki. It is a joy, Dan, to have you here, and I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. I'm not going to introduce you, because if somebody in the audience doesn't know you, they haven't been living in this planet. Yeah. I am going to delve directly. I have so many things that I want to ask you. And I want to start with the fact that 7 and forthcoming, the next book, a total of 8, have a single protagonist, Robert Langdon, with whom you have spent as an author quite some time. I think the very first book and the research that I was doing dates back to the early 2000s, and so it's 20 more years than that. I wonder if you can reflect on the kind of relationship that you have with Langdon. I know that he has your same birthday date. I know that he went to similar schools that you, and that you have sometimes said that you wished you were him, or maybe
he's significant. He's the guy I wish I could be. He's significantly braver, significantly cooler, and has really quite an exotic life. I sit, alone at a computer in my pajamas and try to make somebody else's life exciting. It's funny. I remember once I was asked a similar question in a big talk. And by the way, I wish I could be there with you at Stern instead. A bit of a commute from here, but another time.
Another time.
But I was asked, how can I said Robert Langdon's smarter than I. And somebody said, well, how can that be? Because everything that he says, you have to think of. Yeah. And I had to explain that when Robert Langdon's in a scene and walks by a Caravaggio and off the cuff gives a beautiful historical description of what it is, that took me like 2 days to write. So that was sort of the point that you're seeing this character who is it was really reacting in real time. But these things aren't happening in real time in my head. They're trial and error.
How did he emerge as as a character? And also, Dan, having spent more than 20 years with him, how has he changed with you, and how have you changed toward him?
He's aging much slower than I am, it seems. But it's funny. I remember when we turned the Da Vinci Code into a movie, and I had to make a list for Sony Pictures of all the things they couldn't change. And that was really the first time I'd thought about who this character was and why. I knew who he was, but what was really important to me. And I realized that one of the most important things was that he used his mind rather than violence to get out of situations. And I grew up on the campus of Phillips Exeter Academy, and my babysitters were students from all over the world. I grew up in a very open-minded melting pot of race and religion and philosophy among teachers. And so I grew up in a very academic environment. So when I looked for a hero, I created a hero that was an amalgam of the people I respected who were teachers. And my dad was a teacher, and still is a teacher in many ways. My mom taught piano and was a wonderful teacher at home. And so I grew up idolizing teachers. And so when I went to create this hero, he was a professor. Mm-hmm. And when he was in trouble, he used his head and his experience to solve problems. And so when Sony Pictures came to me, I said, well, you can't teach him jujitsu overnight. You can't teach him how to use a gun. He can't suddenly become an acrobat who can jump off buildings. And it's sort of interesting that your question's interesting. Who is this guy and where did he come from? That was sort of the first time I had to really think about it.
Yeah. And have you, when graduating from Amherst, did you consider a life of teaching? Have you ever seen yourself as a teacher, or by having him, you projected that side and eliminated it in you?
No, I still teach occasionally. And if I weren't writing, I would be teaching. And I have taught. I taught during my first 4 novels because they didn't sell any. And I had a teaching job. I got up at 4 a.m. and wrote from 4 to 8 a.m., rode a bike 7 miles to teach Spanish at middle school, rode back, taught English at Phillips Exeter in the afternoons, corrected papers at night, and got up and did it all over again the next day. And so and I love teaching. I absolutely love that. And I think that's why all of these novels contain a few, they're flashbacks of lectures. Is basically, Langdon walks out on stage and it's so fun to see him talk to students. Right. I love teaching and wouldn't be surprised if I go back to it. In fact, I just finished a couple of years ago doing something called Masterclass. I don't know if you're familiar with masterclass.com, but I did one of those, and that was fascinating to really talk about the nuts and bolts of creating plot, creating character, creating suspense. And it was interesting because I remember when Masterclass first came to me and said, we'd like you to do this. They were a brand new company. I think they had some big names, but I just thought, well, I don't really think that you can talk about writing for 8 hours. I don't think there's anything there. And I didn't want to sort of be one of those teachers who said, well, write what you know and stick with it and, be optimistic. But they came back a number of times. And I finally said, well, let me just see if I can create a curriculum. Let me see what kind of specifics I could actually share. And as I sat down, I realized how much I had learned by trial and error, by making mistakes along the way, and how much I really did have to share about the process. Yeah. And we that could have gone on for 16 hours. We went on, I think, for 8. And I just keep hearing how helpful it was. And people have thanked me, and I've said, well, that was just me telling you what I did wrong, and figured out. So, you're a step ahead of me now.
Would you imagine if you did at some point go back to teaching that it would be about writing, or it would be closer to what Langdon does, teach about symbols, teach about conspiracies, teach about the history of religion? Would that be something that you might consider at some point?
I do. I think either. I mean, I would also talk a lot about technology and its influence on culture. It's interesting. I'm about to launch into a documentary series that I'm doing about really the trajectory that we've taken as a species historically with religion, and how technology has challenged religion along the way, and what's going to happen in the future. And one of the big questions is when we create life in a laboratory, which almost certainly has either happened or will happen very, very soon. What does that say to this notion that creating life is the realm of God? How do we reframe that such that it still works for us? Those sorts of questions fascinate me. I would probably teach on something like that, but my real passion would be teaching language. I love language, and it's interesting. I write in a very specific way that people either really like or really hate. There's not a lot of in between. It's funny. Da Vinci Code was called the greatest American novel ever written and the rape of modern literature, all in the same week. My guess is it's somewhere in between. But the point is, I had a wonderful teacher at Amherst, Alan Lelchuk, a great novelist and just a fantastic teacher, who really taught everyone in a different way. And one of my challenges was verbosity and just using too much language. And I remember him saying, like, the point of language is to communicate an idea. Yeah. It's not to remind us how many words you know or how intricate a sentence can be. The idea is to convey what you're trying to say. And that's something that I was taught at Exeter also. It just took me a long time to eventually find that voice.
I want to go deeper down into your relationship with language and your relationship with the English language. When you started writing, how has it changed over the years between the very first books that you wrote and the last books? Does it come easier to figure out in terms of language what goes on the page? Does it become harder because of the expectations that readers have already of you? What kind of link do you have with the choice of words that you put on the page? How often do you massage a sentence? Talk to me a little bit about that relationship with language.
I'm an incredibly slow writer, and it's because I never get it right the first time, and I know when it's right, which means I also know when it's wrong. So yeah. I'll create a paragraph, or sometimes it's even just a sentence, and not like it, and not like it, and not like it, and finally like it. It's interesting that there's a great quote. I can't. It might have been Stephen King, but I think it was the difference between good writers and bad writers is that good writers know when they're bad. It's a very simple concept, but it's absolutely true. That writing is about editing. I don't know anybody. I know a lot of very good authors. I've never met one who gets it right the first time. Yeah. And in many ways, I would say that the writing process has not gotten any easier. I don't know whether it's. You would think it would get easier, but on some level, the expectation on oneself and also from one's fan base becomes higher and higher. You want to make sure that your next novel is better than the one before.
I know that you and I were talking a couple of weeks ago about this. You work very closely with your longtime editor. But before we reach that connection with the editor, in this process of finding the moment in which the sentence feels right, having gone through all this transformation, do you show your work to anybody else, or are you absolutely private, not even discussing what the plot might be or how the chapters might be shaping up until you have a critical mass, until your editor sees it? What's the process?
Yeah, there has to be a critical mass. I mean, that may not be true for all authors, but my books have a lot to do with pace. I mean, that's just one of the things that people enjoy about the books is that they have pace and there's a rhythm to them. And so it doesn't do a lot of good to say, hey, here's 2 pages. You really need 20 pages to get a sense. And oftentimes for this last book, my editor saw nothing before I had 100 pages, 200 manuscript pages. Yeah. But now, as we've gone through the process, once we're well into it, I might call him and say, hey, Langdon's in the following situation, and I'm thinking of solving it this way or this way. Have you got any instincts? And he's just a terrific. I mean, he reads thrillers for a living. And he's seen everything, and often has interesting takes. Or I'll say, I'm thinking of doing this, and they'll say, actually, that's something we've kind of seen before. What else have you got? Yeah. And so that's very, very helpful. The editing process really starts with him, and it's about a 3-tier process. He'll do his first edit, which is, hey, this section feels a little bit too big and doesn't feel related to this. And so you basically rewrite the whole manuscript based on big comments. This would be better from her perspective, this whole scene, for example, those sorts of things. And then there's a line edit that is just language based. We go through and, you don't need that, he said, or, this sentence is sort of hard to follow, that sort of thing. And then once the manuscript's in shape, meaning you've got the plot right and you've got the language as close as you can get, then it goes to attorneys who make sure that you're not going to get sued for saying something. I write about real people and real things, and there's every time a book come out, somebody's seems to take. Oh yes, yeah. I'm 11-0. If anybody's thinking of it, just I'm really, really careful to make sure that I'm fair in these books. And then it goes to fact checkers who literally will say, this car chase, I know when you wrote it, this one-way street in Paris was going north-south, but now it's going south-north, and you got to change it. Yeah. And usually you say, okay, I'll change it. And sometimes you just say, I don't think that's really worth the trouble.
Yeah. The other day when you and I were talking, you told me something that struck me, that fascinated me. You said that at this point, and I hope that I am quoting you in the right way, and if not, of course, correct me. You said that you had finished the book, your next book, and I want to talk about that next book in a second, and that your editor had now seen it complete even before you had seen it complete. Is that, am I misremembering, or did you say something?
I guess in a sense, I'm not quite sure what I meant by that, but I certainly, my editor is the first one to have the complete manuscript. This is a huge book. It's the biggest book I've ever written, much longer, much more intricate than anything I've ever written.
Huge in terms of the amount of words?
Yes.
Amount of pages?
Yeah. Amount of characters, amount of pages. Yeah. And it's all actually in a even a shorter time frame. So in addition to expanding it, I've compressed it time-wise. And so maybe what I meant by that was that he had the whole manuscript, and I didn't have it. I'd been sending it in pieces, and he'd been editing along the way. Yeah. And but it's he certainly sees the whole thing before anybody else does.
I am fascinated as a publisher myself and as an editor about the relationship that an author builds with an editor. How did you become so close with him over all these years, to the point that you feel that a suggestion that he might make would be, you would go in that direction? That you truly trust him?
I've been super lucky. It's like we were made to work together. I was at Simon & Schuster for my first couple of books, and he got hired by Simon & Schuster. The guy who bought Angels and Demons, he purchased it for Simon & Schuster and then was fired. I thought, well, that's not a good sign. So Jason Kaufman, my editor, was hired by Simon & Schuster and just acquired my manuscript and called me and said, this is really fun. And we worked on it and published Angels and Demons with Simon & Schuster. It did nothing. It sold like 3,000 copies. Nobody, didn't get reviewed. Nobody bought it. I wrote a novel after that called Deception Point, which did the same thing. Nobody bought it. Nobody even knew it existed. And Jason was being wooed by Doubleday at Random House. And he said, I'll come, but I've got to bring this one author. And it was me. He said, there's something about I just feel like these are hits, and they just haven't found their audience. And so Random House read the opening 100 pages of a book that I had wanted to sell to Simon & Schuster. But it wasn't the opening 100 pages. It was a 100-page outline.
Yeah.
Of a book.
Outline.
100-page outline. Okay, these are manuscript pages, double spaced, but it's a long outline for a novel called The Da Vinci Code.
Yeah.
And they read it and said, I think we'll do this. And they gave me a relatively small advance, but for me it was much more than I'd ever made, and it meant that I could stop teaching for a year and write the book, and I did.
Yeah. How would those authors find an audience? Do you think that when the Da Vinci Code was published, people were hoping to get, and they had heard your name maybe in the background and it clicked? What is it that makes one book all of a sudden catch fire and the previous books that might be equal in quality disappear from the face of the earth?
Yeah, it's I'll give you the honest answer, and it's tough for authors who are struggling, because the honest answer about the Da Vinci Code is, people have read my book, say, oh, I love Da Vinci Code, but I like Angels and Demons better, or I like Deception Point better, these books that did nothing. So it wasn't that it was a magical book. It was published very, very well, meaning the publisher read the manuscript and said, you know what, we can make this a bestseller. And 6 months before first of all, they printed 10,000 advance copies, free copies of the book, which they sent to booksellers. 10,000 copies was more books than I'd ever published, and they were just giving them away. So they sent them out to booksellers, and then they sent me on tour 6 months before the book came out to meet booksellers. And so I just went. I met, I met the Barnes and Nobles guys. I went and met Borders. This is back when we had real bookstores. And I meet the independent booksellers, and I went all across the country. And I said, well, what am I supposed to do? And the publisher just said, they just want to know you're not a jerk. They love your book. They just want to know that you're a nice guy. And I said, well, I'll try. And I remember I was in Ann Arbor at Borders, and there was this woman who was talking about having met me and how nice it was. And she kept saying that and what's even the book's great, but what's even better is that you're adorable. And I kept thinking, well, that's really weird that somebody would say that. I found out she said it many, many times. I finally asked him, and said, no, she's saying you are tourable. We can put you on tour. So a lot of authors, you can't put them on tour because they live in their pajamas in the dark and they can't come out into the spotlight. But so apparently I was tourable, and they took that to heart, and I've done quite a bit of touring, which I absolutely love. Yeah. So much of it is for book promotion, but it's all over the world. These books are in 56 languages, and so we're all over the place.
In fact, I was going to go to the tours and to the celebrity, but I'm going to wait for just 1 second, because you were telling me the other day also something extraordinary, that for this new book that is going to come out, the translators, about, I don't know, 50 or so, have been all called into one place, I think in Spain, you said, where they are translating in the same building or in the same room, the same book into all these languages, because the book has to appear simultaneously. Otherwise, the English language edition can eat from the other edition. So I imagine this room with the translators all competing or typing. It's a fascinating phenomenon when most translators suffer of isolation and underpayment. Tell me about that process of working with translators or not working with
translators. Well, people say, well, do you like the translation? It's like, well, this is the Taiwanese edition. I can't find my name on the cover. I couldn't tell you if it's a good translation. The only thing that we have to go on is whether or not it gets good reviews and sells. And if it does, you assume that somebody has taken what you've done and turned it into something that makes sense to the people of that language and that culture. They call it it's a bunker, really, is what they call it. It's called the translating bunker. And, it's very, very important that the book doesn't leak beforehand. So it's difficult to translate it if you sort of email a manuscript to somebody in Netherlands and they're trying to translate it and you just hope nobody gets a copy. It's dangerous. So what happens is these people come into a room and use computers that are already there. They have to leave all their technology outside, no phones. And what they do is they take the Romance languages and put them together. Basically, it's the Germanic language, the Slavic language. so they can help each other.
Yeah.
Such the Italian can say, hey, you can look to the guy who speaks Portuguese and say, how are you doing this word? Or this phrase. And it's, I guess there's a lot of camaraderie.
Do you get involved in that
fun.
process? Do you show up? Do they ask you questions?
I'm not, occasionally I'll get email questions, and it usually has to do with gender, because English has ways of hiding gender, with kind of neutral, they, and I mean, lots of different ways that we sort of avoid revealing the gender of a character. And you can't do that in some, certainly the romance languages have a lot of trouble doing that. And so I get questions about that occasionally. I'll definitely get them on this new book. But it's I don't know, it's a lot of fun. I do show up.
Go ahead.
The last bunker was in Barcelona, and I just showed up one day with sandwiches. Just walked in like a waiter. It took him a minute, but we had quite a laugh over that and talked.
In fact, maybe I don't remember. A decade and a half ago, I had a conversation with a series of translators who had been doing John le Carré's The Little Drummer Girl in a similar bunker, all sequestered in order to have the book ready. But one of them was telling me, kind of representing what others were doing, that they were getting the manuscript as the manuscript was getting finished. They had not seen the entire book. And that the name of the character, I think it was a Palestinian girl at that point, kept on changing from the bulk of the first 100 pages to the second, and that in some editions it looks as if it's not only one Palestinian girl, but a number of Palestinian girls that show up. Do these translators get the whole book, get portions of the book? Do they, in order to avoid it leaking to the outside world, do you guys, your company, your people, protect the entire plot in some way?
Sure. I mean, we never give a manuscript until it's fully complete, because I'm editing right up until we hit send. And thank God that there are deadlines, because I'd still be working on the Da Vinci Code. It's just they say novels are never finished; they're just abandoned, which is kind of true. And I've changed characters' names at the 11th hour. We had one instance where I used a search and replace to change a name, and unfortunately changed a couple other things that hadn't occurred to me. But fortunately, they were caught. And as far as protecting the manuscript, we do something pretty interesting. We secretly watermark every manuscript. So we will send a different version to each individual translator. And in each version, I change one tiny detail. And in the book Inferno, there was a yacht that was 382 feet long in the Italian edition, and 283 feet long in the Spanish edition, 284 feet long. And we just had a list. And we didn't tell anybody what it was. In fact, my publisher didn't know what it was. That was my job. And I was the only one who knew. And I had a list. And we just told them, listen, these are all watermarked. If they leak, we're going to know which country was responsible. And we've never had a leak. It's pretty amazing.
Are you then? So I think I read somewhere that your books have sold combined 200 million copies. I don't know if this number is accurate or not, but even a million copies to me, it seems like an enormous number. When you write your next book, knowing that it will be read by this many people, who do you write for? Do you write for an American audience? Do you write for a global audience? Is there a difference between them? How do you sort this out? 200 million people.
It's a great question. And when Da Vinci Code came out and reached such a big audience, I sat down to write my next novel, The Lost Symbol, and must have rewritten the first sentence, for weeks. Just like, oh my God, millions of people are going to read this. And I became very self-aware, which is the kiss of death. And anybody on the call who's an athlete or a musician or an actor, I mean, that self-awareness is the end. You can't swing a baseball bat if you're thinking about how to do it. You can't sing if you're thinking about how to do it. And somewhere along the way, I realized, oh, wait a minute, I just wrote the book that I wanted to read. I was writing for me. And I often end up, I mentor a bunch of young writers and have to explain to them, listen, you know, all you have to guide yourself is your taste. Whether you are, whether you're a writer, a musician, or a chef,
yeah.
do is create, you know, the novel, the sonata, or the souffle that you personally like. And then you just hope other people share your taste.
Yeah.
So Da Vinci Code was the novel that I wanted to read. It had all the elements that I liked. It had the pace I liked. And I said, oh, that's all I have to do. I just have to write something that keeps me interested and keeps me engaged. And after that, I've really had no trouble imagining
really,
who's going to be reading my novel.
That really was the cure to self-awareness, because as a teacher too, self-awareness could be the kiss of death. And you talked about a baseball player, and you could talk about a chef, but curing oneself of self-awareness, particularly when one writes for so many readers. I mean, again, going back to the question that I was asking you, Dan, when one writes for one's language readers, one knows more or less the taste that they have. But when one writes for this millions and millions of people, do you feel that self-aware, does it make you still a little bit vulnerable, a little bit fragile? Do you?
No,
Yeah.
I've become accustomed to having people either really like or really dislike what I do. And I've had,
Yeah.
you know, wonderful things said and horrible things said. And I'm not going to lie, you know, I wish everybody liked what I do. That would be great, but that's not the way the arts work. And I remember when Da Vinci Code came out, all the reviews were fantastic for the first month. And John Grisham called me and said, hey, congratulations, but just get ready, because the press thrives on change. And there's a second wave of reviews coming, I guarantee it. And they came. It was kind of tough to say, wow, there are people who really don't like this at all. And that just, I think it just takes time. You have to develop a callus on your ego somehow and just say, okay, well, those people have the luxury of not buying my next book. You know, you say I'm writing for all these people. I'm writing for the people who choose to buy my book, who are interested in what I write or who have read something else that I've written and liked it.
Yeah.
So I really have gotten past all that. I think you have to. You really have to. I remember I was talking to a strange person who told me this. Hillary Clinton said that she read her. She didn't read any of her press, because if they liked what she was doing, she'd get lazy and complacent. And if they didn't like what she was doing, she'd become self-aware and question herself. Obviously, totally different arena, but I think it's true for all of us that if you listen to your critics, if you listen to the people who love you, you better be listening to people who don't like you also, and vice versa. So it's better, neither one is helpful. So you might as well just put on the blinders, create the artifact that makes you happy. Even if you're a teacher, you be the teacher that you'd want to have to listen to.
Yeah. And you, unlike Hillary Clinton, read every review that comes before you about your books?
No. However, I'm not going to lie and say I don't read them. I do. I don't read them all. I read the big ones. And plus, these books come out in so many languages. There are just so many reviews. And at the end of the day, really hope for is to hear from readers for whom the book has struck a chord. And I know when Da Vinci Code came out, I was amazed the amount of mail that I got from Catholic nuns, thinking, okay, and I assumed it would not be favorable. All of this mail from nuns was favorable and said, thank you for pointing out this notion of the sacred feminine, this idea that we've literally married Jesus. We literally have given up our lives and dedicated them to Jesus, and we're still not fit to stand behind the altar or to give communion or to be a priest. And thanks for pointing that out to millions of people. And those are the sorts of moments that you say, I don't care if the London Times thought this was the worst book ever written. This struck a chord with somebody, and that's meaningful to me.
You grew up religious.
I did.
But you've moved away from religion over time, and have you come back to it? Tell me about your relationship with religion.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I grew up. My mom was a church organist. I was in a church choir. I was Episcopal in Episcopal choir. I went to a Christian summer camp for a few years. Read the Bible and found the magic of church. I just found it mystical. The music in particular. And when I was about maybe 8 or 9 years old, I went to the Boston Museum of Science and learned about the Big Bang and evolution, and said, "Wait, what about Adam and Eve and Genesis?" And asked the priest which story was true. And the answer I got was, "Nice boys don't ask that question." And so that was the question I started asking, really through the rest of school. At Amherst, I studied a lot of science, took cosmology and geology, and really loved science, and went on to explore as much science as possible and write about science. And the further I got into science, and when I was writing Angels and Demons, I was doing a lot of research on particle physics and antimatter, and talking to people and pretending I understood what they were talking about. It was all incredibly advanced quantum physics. And I started to realize that the deeper you go into science, the more spiritual the questions start to sound. And you sort of think you're going to end up on concrete ground, but you end up with uncertainty principles and margins of error and imaginary numbers and all sorts of things that start to feel kind of squishy under your feet. And you just come full circle and you realize, oh, we're all asking the same big questions. And I like to think of science and religion as two different languages attempting to tell the same story.
And as you have aged, and you said that your character has aged actually slower than you.
Yes, he's doing a little better.
Have you returned to some of these questions, not from a spiritual or from a more magical way, but more in a religious way, the way your parents taught you? Do you feel a kind of return to the primal and primary questions that sidestep science in some ways?
No. I do. I have certainly returned to a spirituality and to the big questions, and to a feeling of awe and acceptance that there's something bigger that's going on here that I don't understand. Yeah. I do not think it has to do with ancient scripture. And I remember, being in Japan as a pretty young kid. Actually, no, it was on Amherst College Glee Club tour. I wasn't a young kid. We were in Tokyo, and I remember thinking a lot about religion and seeing all these young children on a playground and thinking, well, they've never heard of Jesus Christ, but my religion says that that's a sin, that they can't possibly be saved. And I was looking at all these young children and say, well, that it just doesn't make sense to me. Of course, that's a very literal reading of Christianity. But I think to answer your question, I've moved farther from doctrine and dogma and our sort of reliance on ancient scripture, which, I mean, I see the Bible as a great series of metaphors that we should not read literally. And when we do, that's when we get into trouble. That's my own personal opinion. Yeah. But the big questions, I've just spent 5 years writing a novel about some of the biggest questions there are, and they're spiritual questions, and they deal with human consciousness and our sense of self and where we're going after all this, if anywhere. Those sorts of ideas.
Because your new novel is about human consciousness. It's different from the previous one, and you were telling me it's more challenging to put all the plot together as a result.
Yeah. Well, so one reason this book has taken 5 years is that the topic of human consciousness is I don't want to say it's soft, but it's soft. It's ethereal. It's kind of hard to get your arms around. It's hard to even define. And when I wrote Angels and Demons, I just took an antimatter bomb and put it in the Vatican, and the book just sort of laid out in front of me. Human consciousness has been a little bit tricky, and it took maybe literally a year of drafting to figure out how do you put Langdon in the middle of a world that deals with human consciousness, that has all the elements of a thriller. It has a ticking clock. It has danger. It has revelation. It has all sorts of deception. And it took a long time to figure out how to do that. And once I did, the book's been a lot of fun to write. It's just been a big book.
I want to remind the audience that in about 10 minutes, we will open it up I will start looking at the Q&A, which is where you should put questions if you are interested in my filtering them and asking them to Dan, and open to different perspectives. Dan, I want to ask you, while you are writing any novel from the past, when you were writing this novel in particular about human consciousness, do your dreams change? What is the dream life of Dan Brown when he's in the middle of a novel? Do dreams contribute to the plot, or bother the plot, or make you anxious? And when you're not writing a novel, if you ever can say that you're not writing a novel, do your dreams have another texture, another language?
Wow, a fascinating question. I dream a lot. I dream every night, and have practiced lucid dreaming, and am very connected to that part of my life, and take a lot of notes on dreams and that sort of thing. In my experience, I've never had a dream that specifically has helped me in any way with a novel. I've never sort of woken up and said, "Oh, what a great scene." But what I do, and I would say almost every night, before I fall asleep, I try to make sure my last thought is what I'll be writing the next morning. And I put myself in that frame of mind. And there's usually some question. It might be as simple as, from whose point of view am I going to tell this bit of the story? Or what are some of the analogies or metaphors I'm going to use to take this incredibly complicated topic and make it accessible? So they're very they're specific questions, and yet I don't wake up with absolute answers. But for some reason, I have this sense that my subconscious has worked on it overnight, because I'm very clear in the morning, and what I didn't know the night before, I know that morning, not in a flash of not in an epiphany, just inherently you sit down and you know how to do it.
And you sleep well? You always sleep well? Or do you have trouble dreams?
I sleep 6 hours a night, and I go to bed pretty early. I'm up between 3 and 3:30 every day. That's when I work.
Correct. Yeah.
And if some night I go to bed at 11 because I've been out, I will wake up at 5. 6 hours later, almost to the minute. It's very strange. I don't set an alarm, and I've tried to sleep more, but I wake up, and within 30 seconds, I sort of think like, I'm up. I'm ready to go.
Yeah.
I do dream a lot, but it doesn't trouble me. I don't. I do have nightmares. I had a lot of recurring nightmares as a kid, which is one of the reasons I got into lucid dreaming for a while, which was helpful.
Do you love writing about secrets, or about hidden societies, about thoughts that people might be in the periphery of things? Do you think that this type of elements are much more at the center of culture right now than when you were a young man, as a result of social media and of this alternative ways of looking at society, and the fact that there are rumors, and have you contributed? Maybe I can ask this: have you, in your style, in the success that you have had, and others like you, contributed to this type of rumors that become much more tangible, especially in politics?
I don't write about politics. I certainly have not tried to contribute in any way, and I think it might be overstating my impact. When you look at what's going on in the world, to imagine that I have. I think people are drawn to conspiracy theories for the same reason, and I mean this with enormous respect, and I'll explain myself in it, but the same reason they're drawn to religion. The human mind has a very, very hard time processing the notion that life is random. And I remember when I was a little kid, a young girl in our parish died of leukemia, and the priest gave a sermon that said it was part of God's plan.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember being so upset that it didn't make sense that God would have a plan like that. It just didn't make sense to me. And so, just as far as conspiracy, I think that statement as part of God's plan is meant to comfort, and actually somehow does comfort, because we think, okay, somebody's in control. This wasn't just bad luck. Someone's in control. And that's why prayer is so comforting, that we're saying, like, I can't handle this, but I know you'll do it. Yeah. This isn't just random, like somebody's pulling the strings. And that's really that's a more comfortable thought than life is random. Yeah. And that's why conspiracy theory exists. Because it's much more comforting on some level to believe that bad things happen because a bunch of people are in a dark room plotting it, then it's just a random series of events, and that's what happened. And so we gravitate toward these sorts of alternate narratives, really, to give ourselves comfort. Even if we don't like the narrative, at least we know what's happening. And it gives us something to be angry at, something to have faith in. It gives us a purpose and a sense that is not random.
I think I want to ask you, connected with the last 2-3 questions, do you believe in God?
Again, it's one of those things we got to define God. I do not believe in the God that I grew up with. Right. And I've had this conversation, and the Christian God is an omnipotent, benevolent God, and that's the way it was described, all powerful, and with good intentions. You say, well, let's step back and look at that logically. There's horrible stuff that happens in the world. Right. So you have to either assume that God is powerless to help, or that he doesn't care, one or the other. He can't care and be able to help, or things wouldn't look like this. And it's a pretty cold way to look at things. But when I look at the picture that is painted of the God that I grew up with, that's the picture that I was given. And that no longer makes sense to me. I do strongly believe, and I'm believing more and more, especially having researched this book, that human consciousness is not as we think it is. And this is basically the premise of the book, that there's a certain element to human consciousness that we've not yet glimpsed. And this book talks about what that might be. And I guess on some levels you could define it as God, as a communion of souls in some way. So I hope I've dodged your question. That's right.
And how about free will? You do believe you believe that the shape of Dan Brown's career is the shape that Dan Brown has made of that career, or was it pre-planned?
For the amount of effort I put in, I sure feel like I've had something to do with it. I will tell you, there's a really fun chapter in this new book talking about free will. Yeah. And in the scene, a woman is telling Langdon, there is no free will. And he say, well, there's got to be free will. And she leans over and kisses him and says, I don't know where that decision came from. Yeah. But isn't the illusion of free will enough? If that came from somewhere else, isn't the illusion enough that I had that idea? And that's sort of an interesting question. Less convinced there's free will than I was 5 years ago.
You're less convinced or more convinced?
Less convinced.
I'm reminded right now of Nobel Prize winner Isaac Bashevis Singer, who said once, "We have to believe in free will. We have no choice."
What a great! I mean, I may just steal that. That's right, with a footnote
to him. I want to ask you. I'm beginning to read, Dan, the many questions that are here, and it might take me the 5 years that took you to write this novel, and I'm going to filter and combine some of them. I want to ask you, as I do, and there's one of them there. You like to insert clues and secrets in your novels, sometimes a name, sometimes, or you were saying watermarking this for the different translators. I read somewhere that for the holidays, might be for Christmas, please correct me, your parents used to give you some kind of a treasure hunt in order to finally get the present or finally get, so it was embedded in your education, it was embedded into your DNA. Do you actually expect that there are different types of readers for your books? The readers that read it in a plane quickly and will forget about it, and other readers that will kind of the Illuminati, or that can see something deeper and more complex, lasting, and will connect the message from one book to the message of another, like a Kabbalah of some sort?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely different kinds of readers. I've met people who say, like, I think I read that one. What is that, the one where, you know? And I've had people say, no, I read this book 7 times.
Yeah.
And on the 7th time, I noticed that the first letter of every odd numbered chapter spells whatever it spells. And there's stuff like that all over the books that I don't talk about. I do it for my own amusement. And there's 3 or 4 people in the world who apparently have enough time to find it. And that's always amusing. But yeah, I grew up, I've been asked, why do you write about symbols and codes? And my mom was a musician, and I grew up a musician playing music. That's a symbolic language. My dad, I was a math teacher and a math textbook author. Math is a symbolic language.
Yeah.
And again, we came down on Christmas morning, and there was a treasure hunt to find our presents. So for me, treasure hunts, they instantly represent fun and mystery and discovery. And in the novel Inferno, the female character actually tells the villain, like, when I was a little kid, like, this is how I grew up. My dad would give me these treasure hunts. Actually, excuse me, that was Da Vinci Code. That was Sophie who did that. Yeah. And that's, right out of my world.
Mm-hmm. I want to thank you about, I'm going to thank you at the end, but I want to thank you because particularly now, because Landon is not only a professor, he's a Harvard professor, he's also a professor of a discipline that doesn't quite exist in the world. It's not semiotics, but it's a iconology and symbology. So not only have you created an alter ego, but you've created a nice new discipline that maybe I should start, or we should start teaching. How would you define iconology?
Iconology is essentially symbology, but iconology deals more with the ancient. Symbology you may be able to sit down and say, let me tell you about the Nike logo and why that's important and what it. Iconography also has more to do with written symbol.
Yeah.
But iconography is actually a word. Symbology is now a word. I got a letter from the Oxford English Dictionary saying it is now a word. Probably said, I guess so. I don't know, but I see it all the time now. But it's funny, when the book came out, I mean, there was who was it? Umberto Eco said, like, what is this? I'm a semiotician. What is this?
He wrote to you? No.
Oh yeah. No, it's pretty funny because Umberto Eco is not a fan of my work at all. And he made that very, very clear. But I was on book tour. I was in Milan and went to Prima della Scala, the opening of the opera season, and was seated directly behind Umberto Eco. And at the first intermission, we stood up, and I said, "I'm Dan Brown. I'm a fan of yours. I know you're not a fan of mine." And he said, "I never said I wasn't a fan. I said I invented you." I thought, I'm not sure that's any better. So it was a very strange conversation.
Yeah.
But
there's a question here of, and I'm sure you get this question many times, Dan, which authors have inspired you? And I would like to throw in 1 or 2 names, because I've heard you talked about them, and I think it would be appropriate here, perhaps because at one point in the future you could even teach something connected. Joseph Campbell on the one hand, and on the other hand, Carl Gustav Jung, who was a disciple of Freud, both very interested in the subconscious, in symbology, in how from one culture to another we inherit a large language that passes on, maybe in the DNA. But let me go back to this alum, the authors that inspired you to become the Dan Brown that you are.
Well, I mean, certainly Joseph Campbell, without a doubt, his Hero of a Thousand Faces and The Power of Myth. This idea, as you just said, that we have these ideas and these philosophies that are passed down to us through language. We're either told about them or we read about them, and yet it seems that there's more than that. It's passed down almost genetically somehow. And I'm just fascinated by that idea about how culture evolves, how a symbol, how you can take a line like this and a line like this, and you create a Christian cross. They're 2 lines, and it carries centuries of meaning. to so many people, and actually means different things to different people. That's fascinating to me, and that's the sort of thing that Robert Langdon is very good at understanding and articulating. Again, his erudite lecture might take me a month to write, but he's really good at it. As far as other authors, it's Robert Ludlum, certainly for his level of plotting, the intricacy, and the sort of the international settings. This will sound kind of geeky, but read a lot of Shakespeare in high school, a ton of it, and taught a lot of it later. The wordplay, the humor, and just the drama. I mean, it's so much is overwrought in a perfect way. And I think you're always, when you're writing a thriller, you're always trying to you're trying to turn it up to 110%, but have it feel like it's only 90. So you sort of, you don't feel like it's over the top, but if you really step back, you go, wow, that really was over the top. And that's something I think that Shakespeare does brilliantly. It's funny. I was a musician, and when I was at Amherst, I spent all my time in the music building. I was either writing short stories for Alan Melchuk or composing music for Lou Spratlin. I, out of college, thought, well, I know I want to be creative with my life. I either want to write books or write music. And I thought, well, writing music will be much more fun. And I went to Los Angeles and got a record deal and had a record come out and sold 5 copies. Absolutely tanked. And I actually heard it about a year ago, and now I know why it tanked. But that's another that's another story. But I remember what I was going to say, that when I left Amherst, I decided to be a musician, and I spent a lot of time making music, and kind of forgot reading and writing, and just composed music and just listened to music. And I was on vacation in Tahiti and found a paperback on the dock, just this old paperback that somebody left, and it was a book by Sidney Sheldon called Doomsday Conspiracy. And I hadn't read any adult fiction other than the classics. I just hadn't. I'd read all the Hardy Boys as a kid, and then everything that we read at Amherst, Edmund Spencer, and suddenly I was reading this book and I couldn't stop turning pages, and it was light and it was fun and it was interesting and it took me into different. And I said, this is Hardy Boys for adults. That's what this is. And I literally thought I could do this.
And that's what you did.
I would say maybe 3 months later, I had an idea for a book. And I got up and I said, okay, I'm going to write a book. And about halfway through, I thought, what am I doing? How did I convince myself that I knew how to do this? And I stepped back and I went and read a lot of books on how to write books, because I just suddenly panicked and thought, wow.
But you figured out on your own.
Yeah.
Dan, do you think that we do a disservice at places like Amherst, teaching Cervantes and Shakespeare and Dante, but not Ludlum and Stephen King and Dan Brown? Should we be, after all, those are the authors that are read by, every author complains that they don't have enough readers. Dan Brown doesn't complain that he doesn't have any readers. We often lament the fact that the average American reads maybe a book and a half a year. That likely is a Dan Brown or a Stephen King book. Do you think colleges and universities should be less snobby and pretentious about what literature is, and should accept the fact that popular literature is as important, or if not as impactful, as the classics? When Cervantes published Don Quixote, everybody trashed that book. Nobody believed that book would survive. Yeah. And now we call it the Age of Cervantes. Do you think there should be spaces like
that? A super loaded question. I'm going to walk around very delicately. I will say, okay, so
you're not going to offend anybody, believe me.
The Divine Comedy, a blockbuster bestseller in its day. Yeah. So maybe there's a moment in history when a book is important.
Yeah.
And maybe I haven't actually thought about this, but I'll just off the top of my head, maybe we are doing a disservice by saying this should still be important today. I mean, also because the language has changed, and you're reading a foreign language.
Yeah.
I will say this. I think that if you've gone to Amherst College and have read Cervantes and Edmund Spenser and the Canterbury Tales and whatever it is you've read, and if you're anything like me, struggled through them, did your best, but really didn't have a whole lot of fun reading, and if you could skim something, usually did, I think that you come out of college much less likely to keep reading. And I really believe if a place like Amherst chose books that were more immediately relevant and accessible, that people might graduate and say, oh, you know what? I love reading.
Yeah.
My English homework was my favorite homework at school. Like when I could just sit after I did all my math and everything, I could just read this book.
Yeah.
So I do think that we would read more if reading were more fun.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the classics, many of them are so hard to read and frankly feel pretty irrelevant.
On the other hand, if you don't read them in college, you will never read them again.
That's true. I mean, actually, I don't know if that's true, to be honest with you, because I think that the real education for all of us happens later in life. We start to figure out who we are, what we like. And I mean, almost everybody I know reads more now than in school. I mean, you have more time, you have more access, you know what you enjoy.
Do you think it's a mistake that people are going to college from 18 to 22, and in fact, they should be going from 28 to 32?
I think that the time we go to college it really depends on the student.
Yeah.
For me, college was too late, and I was a better student for the 4 years prior to that. Okay. And I would be a much better college student now than I was. And I think that's true for most people. A lot of adults, I think, would say, oh my God, you know what I would give to be able to dive into, to go back and actually explore these things. And I do think that higher education is in a real crisis.
Yeah.
Partly because the world is changing so rapidly. And
partially because the colleges are not keeping up with the change. Why are we in crisis?
I think that the simple answer, which is a partial answer, is that there is so much competing for a student's attention now.
Yeah.
And part of this book that I've been working on is research showing that our attention spans have literally changed over the last 10 years since social media came along. Yeah. We're all multitaskers. Most of the people on this call are simultaneously texting or doing something else. And that's the way we're wired now. And so it's very, very difficult for modern college-age kids to focus in the way that they used to focus. And from talking to professors, college professors that I know, it's an enormous challenge to get people to be able to focus. I mean, the simple fact of not being able to have your phone out while you're listening to a lecture is stressful to a lot of people. And that's brand new.
Dan, so many people have been writing to me here, asking me to prompt you to talk more about your time at Amherst. I don't want to turn this. I never wanted from the beginning into an infomercial about how Amherst did this well or that not well. I noticed that your protagonist went to the same schools except for Amherst. He goes to Princeton, not to Amherst. So your memories of this place, you talked about some good classes that you had. You majored in Spanish. I'm very proud of that. Your experience, you're saying that your real experience was the 4 years prior. What happened at Amherst? What happened to you at Amherst? And what happened at Amherst while you were here that you noticed?
Sure. Well, I mean, and I loved my time at Amherst. I don't want to give the impression just because Langdon didn't go to Amherst doesn't mean I didn't like my time there.
Yeah, no, I'm joking here. I'm joking.
The reason he went to Princeton was because the Princeton it's called the Pear Research Lab was there, and he
it was there,
and
sure.
And also I needed to have a different prep school experience than a college experience. I had the same experience. I went to Phillips Exeter, loved it. I grew up on campus, lived on campus, went to school, taught there, and it was an enormous part of my life. And I think a lot of people who went to sort of had the intensive high school experience, when they get to college, they're kind of tired. And that's, I think, what happened to me on some level. I liked Exeter so much that I chose the school that reminded me of Exeter, and it was Amherst. And all those amazing qualities that Amherst has, I was used to: small classes, a walkable campus, this bucolic setting, and teachers who loved to teach. They weren't just giant lectures. You would sit in small classes and really have discussions about what was important. And I loved that. I took geology. I had a course with Gerald Brophy, who was a professor there, and absolutely loved it and decided I'm going to be a geologist. I started taking geology, and then we hit organic chemistry, or so I don't know what we hit, but it had a lot of chemistry, and I thought I'm not going to be a geologist. And I had been taking English and been writing a lot and enjoyed it. Studied some astronomy, loved language, took German, and then took Spanish. I'd taken a lot of Spanish before.
Yeah.
I went away my junior year. I am fluent, maybe a little generous, but I do speak well, and I live half the year in a Hispanic country, so I get a lot of practice. I loved Amherst, and one thing that I do remember is I played squash at Exeter and loved the sport. And if I had decided to go to Harvard or Princeton or Yale, I never would have made the team. I realized after the fact. I sort of assumed I would have made the team until my friends from Exeter who played squash went to those schools and never played squash again. But I came to Amherst, and they had this amazing squash program with Ed Saris, and I was able to play and loved it, and loved the intramural sports program. Loved the music program. I mean, the experience of singing with Bruce McGinnis in the Glee Club, in the men's choir, was one of my favorite experiences of my life. I can literally say that. And we went on a tour of 13 countries. There may be some people on the call who were on that tour with me, and just magic. You're singing morning mass in San Marcos Cathedral, for 7,000 people, and you're a college kid. And it was remarkable, and I'm grateful for Amherst for all those experiences.
Dan, of all the things that you've done, of all the thrillers that you've written, I was surprised, beautifully and pleasantly surprised, that a couple of maybe 3 years ago you wrote a children's book. It is called Wild Symphony. It's a charming, delightful book. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about it. What prompted you to write a children's book? How different does the author of successful world best-selling novels need to change in order to talk not down to a child, but directly symmetrical to a child? What motivated you? I don't know, your relationship with children, maybe the child in you. I'd love to hear about this.
It's a hilarious story how it came about. I was writing a lot of music right around the time I was at Amherst, and I had a synthesizer and a sequencer, and I was writing fugues and things. I wasn't a good enough keyboardist to play all this stuff, but once I had a sequencer, I could actually write pretty complicated music, and was having a good time doing it. Was out one day taking a walk and heard some frogs in a bog just croaking. And there was like a big low fat one and a high peeper and something in the middle. And they were just and I thought it sounded sort of like a fugue. And I just came home and created this little fugue called Happy Frogs. And then I figured, well, nobody is going to know this is frogs. So I just wrote a silly little poem to go with it. And thought, well, that was kind of fun. And I just did another and then another. And I actually under the title of Synthanimals, published a little cassette. This was 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Published a little cassette and went to Kinko's Copy and made a little book of the poems and tied them together with red ribbon and sold them at the Water Street bookstore in my hometown or the Whirligigs Kid Store. And then they were gone, and I never thought of it again. And
even so talking about Kinko's Copies already places perfectly the entire anecdote. Go on.
I didn't think about it again. It was over. And I was on book tour in China for Origin.
Yeah.
And had an interview on Chinese national television, and it was an hour-long interview. I thought, okay, I don't know what we're going to talk about for an hour, but here we go. And so we come in, and the gentleman talking to me goes, before we talk about Origin, I want to talk about this. And he holds up this little yellow cassette and a little book. And it's like when you meet somebody from your childhood and you know them, but you can't figure out, like, what is that? And he said, it's Synthanimals. You did this a long time ago. I said, well, where did you get this? He goes, well, you guys have this company in America called eBay. I said, okay, so let me see that. He goes, and we're going to play some of this. And so they played some of the music on the air, which I think this is great.
This is in Chinese television.
In Chinese, yeah, in China. So I come out of the interview, and my Chinese book publisher is there with my agent in the green room waiting. And my Chinese publisher says, we want to publish that book. I said, oh, it's silly. He goes, nope, we're going to publish it. So I said, okay, here, knock yourselves out. And literally, like on the back of a napkin, he and my agent made some deal to go publish the book. So my agent calls Random House, where my home publisher, and says, hey, just so you know, in case you hear it through the grapevine, Dan did this little children's thing. It's going to come out in China. We didn't want you to think we went behind your back. And Random House said, we'd like to see that.
Oh, my.
So I didn't have a copy. And I literally had to go to an 82-year-old woman in Exeter, who actually is the mother of an Amherst grad, Pamela Kennedy. And she had a copy, and she loaned it to me.
What a story,
and I sent it to Random House, and they called and said, we think this could be a great children's book, but we also think it needs to be twice as long. We need more music, more poems. And we also, I was working with a producer named Bob Lord who loved the project. And he said, this is classical music. We need to arrange this for orchestra. And so next thing I knew, there was an orchestral version of Wild Symphony. There were enough poems. And I went into Random House. They called me down to New York and said, we need an illustrator. And I didn't know children's illustrators. I'd never done a children's book. And I go in there. They have a huge boardroom table and had about 100 stacks of artwork from all different authors. And they were just numbered, no names. And they said, go through this. We're going to lunch. You take some time and pick, 4 or 5 of these artists that you like. Yeah. And so I did. And they came in and they laughed. I chose 4 artists and they just laughed. They said, you sure you don't read children's books? I said, no. They said, well, you've chosen 3 of the most successful children's book authors in the world and 1 total unknown. And I said, well, I hope the total unknown is not the one who does the alligators with the silly eyes, because that's my first choice. And they said, she's totally unknown. Her name's Susan Batory. She's from Hungary. She's from Budapest. And I said, I don't care. I love her. And they said, we agree.
Oh, my.
They called Susan Batory, said, do you want to do a book with Dan Brown? And she said, okay. And that was Wild Symphony. And now it's out in, I don't know, 30 languages.
That's global. That's your global fandom that pushes you to do a connection with an earlier version of yourself. Yeah.
So it's been a lot of fun, and we're doing a lot of concerts around the world, and we've got one coming up in Dubai that I'm going to go and sit on stage, and I read the poems, and the orchestra plays, and it's just this other life experience that I never imagined.
We're coming. We have about 10 more minutes. Then there are so many questions, so I am filtering. It's somewhat overwhelming. This is not quite the question. There are 3 or 4 like this, so I'm modifying it a little bit with permission from those that have written it. Have you ever tried artificial intelligence asking ChatGPT to write a chapter of a Dan Brown novel?
Yes.
You have?
Out of curiosity, mainly because there's an artificial intelligence that is now publishing short stories as Dan Brown in my style. So, and that's happening to a bunch of authors, but my style is, I don't know, for some reason.
How do you describe your style?
I don't know. It's the style that I'd want to read.
Okay.
It's very, very straight ahead, and it tries to be as transparent as possible, meaning that if I've done a good job, you don't realize you're reading.
Yeah.
You just sort of you just perceive the story. And it's a certain kind of writing. And, you can read The Goldfinch and it's beautiful, but you're very aware that you're reading. So I'm trying to tell a story, basically, is what I'm trying to do. And there's this great quote. I remember going to the Norman Rockwell Museum recently, right near Amherst. And he had this great quote because people hated his artwork. He said, "I'm not trying to be Michelangelo. I'm trying to tell a story." I was like, exactly.
That's
I know.
You.
Yeah.
So go back to artificial intelligence. Do you feel intimidated by AI writing a Dan Brown version?
Yet, if I ask it to write something in the style of Dan Brown, I say, give me a paragraph on St. Peter's Basilica in the style of Dan Brown. I read it and go like, I hope I'm not that bad.
Yeah.
It's me sort of on steroids, sort of it's 120%. Yeah. So it's always an interesting experience to say like, okay, somebody's read my books and they're guessing this is what I would say.
Yeah.
And so far, I'm not too concerned, but it's only Thursday. It's like
let me push you just a little bit. Are you concerned that AI will change the way we produce and consume literature of all types in this country? And is there something that we should be doing about it?
Well, as far as the first question, yeah, I think that it will very, very soon, if it hasn't already, start to change the way that we read. It certainly changed the way that we write. Yeah. People are using it for all sorts of things. I mean, as simple as saying, please write an apology letter that I wasn't at your wedding, and whatever it is, and it does a pretty good job. Yeah. And you can touch it up, and you have your letter. So I know people are using it that way. I think there's a section of this novel where Langdon's editor, Jonas Falkman, which is an anagram of Jason Kaufman, my editor, is sort of bemoaning the state of our writing skill, and hates the fact that we resort to textese. This like we spell good G-U-D, or we spell F-O-R just with a number 4. All these abbreviations, and that certainly has happened. But here's the irony: we are writing more now than we ever have. Everyone has great keyboard skills, and everybody writes actually more than they talk. There's more email, more texting. So that's sort of interesting. That there's much more text being generated by this generation than that was generated by my generation. You can ask, well, is it of any value? Well, yeah, it probably is. I mean, and at the same time, it's changing language. Language, if you look at the language of Emily Bronte and the language of texting, it's pretty lazy. We've gotten really lazy. I remember seeing a manuscript of a novel, The Long and Faithful Love Chase, I think it was called, written, wasn't Emily Bronte, I forget who it was, but it was in longhand, as though the sentences just appeared in her mind, and occasionally something was crossed out. And I think, thank God. I mean, my delete key, I have to replace it every month, just from overuse. It was pretty impressive.
Yeah. Then say something about the new book. Does it have a title already? When is it coming out? Give us just a little bit more. Again, this is not a commercial, but there's a lot of people that are asking, okay, what is that book?
I know. I'm sorry. This book, you have every right to ask. This book has taken 5 or 6 years. It is not for lack of effort. I work almost every day. Yep. It's a big book. It's about human consciousness. It's set in Prague. It does have a title that I'm not allowed to share. Yep. And it should be out. My guess is it will be out, I don't know, sometime around Christmas, maybe a year from now. I'm not sure. It takes a long time. There's a lot of translation, a lot of editing, but the book is complete. We haven't announced that yet. I'm just in edit. At some point, when we have a cover, which we're currently working on,
then it will go out.
Then the news will go out that the book is actually
Dan,
really going to happen.
I know that you don't comment on politics, and you and I had agreed that we would not be talking about politics, and I'm not about to corner you in any way in that realm. Though I'm interested in getting a taste of what you think about the expectations that young people should have right now in a moment in history as the one that we have. What is your recommendation for, people that are about to graduate in such a fractured, fragile, ethereal, nervous, anxious, we can add all kinds of adjectives over there, world?
Yes.
Is escaping the best alternative? It is paying more attention. How do you view things?
Well, I think it's the latter. I mean, paying more attention. I would say get into politics. Put yourself in a position to make change. It's on some level, it's a life sacrifice, because you've got to imagine it's a pretty miserable place to spend your life. It's much easier to escape, to hide in Costa Rica and think up fictional problems for fictional characters. I hate reading the news, and it's funny, when I was on book tour for Origin, it was right around. I can't remember exactly when it was, but Trump was in the news quite a bit, and America was really struggling with a lot of things, and I wanted to talk about my book, and they only wanted to talk about politics, and they said, "Aren't you ashamed of your country?" And I remember saying, "Absolutely not. I'm personally not a fan of what's happening in politics, but I am so grateful to live in a country where I can say that. I can criticize the commander in chief, and I can say I'm not a fan, and I can also write a book that criticizes the major religion of my country, and I can live to tell the tale. Not only live, but actually go on television and discuss it and make a dialogue out of it." And I mean, that's what America is. And yes, this is a weird, ugly, awkward time to be in America, but it's also a speed bump. It's one moment in time.
Yeah.
That will right itself.
Given the amount of lawsuits that you were mentioning and that we know about, and the fact that some of your books have become very controversial because of some of the topics of religion and the conspiracies, do you self-censor when you are making a plot? Do you worry that a certain direction might put you in trouble and you say, no, I'd rather not go there? I know that you're going to have later on lawyers that are going to look at all this and fact checkers, all the things. But is there some inner voice that says, okay, if you're going to do this, you gotta figure out a way that protects you?
Yeah, it's interesting because on a big scale, no. I mean, I've essentially said in Da Vinci Code, what does it mean if Jesus Christ is not the literal Son of God? I mean, that's pretty big. I would say, strangely, the things that upset people are small things, and it's the way you mention a deity, or it's I won't even give you. Won't even stir it up by giving examples. But the point is, I will very often write something, and this happened just recently in the editing process. I got an edit back with a big circle that said, "This is fascinating. Are you sure you want to say this?" And it's still in the book, but I don't think it will last. The more I think about it, the more I think, what's the point? Why would I? It's an interesting point, but it will just alienate somebody. It's certainly not the way it was intended, but that's just the world we live in right now. Everybody's very, very sensitive, and it seems like many people are looking for a reason to be offended.
Yeah.
And that's why when you ask about people, what can they do? Make that change. Rather than being offended, start a dialogue. Yeah. Or be offended in a productive way, I guess is a better way to say it. But go ahead and be offended, but try to hear the other person's point of view. And that goes for me as an author also. That I could say, this is what I think. And believe me, if I say it, I will get other points of view coming back loud and clear.
That's a beautiful place to end, Devin. I am humbled and grateful to you and just delighted to have had this conversation. And I speak on behalf of only myself to say that if at any point you decide, really, there's nobody behind me, you decide to teach somewhere, I would love to see you in a classroom in this place. Maybe me sitting as a student, really wonderful. I thank everybody that joined us today. Many, many people, many, many questions. This is going to be This is recorded and is going to be available. I particularly want to thank again the class of 1970 for the support of Point Counterpoint and all the wonderful people that are behind putting this in the various offices of Amherst College, without whom this would have been impossible. Dear Dan, I'll say this in Spanish, muchísimas gracias, and good luck with the new book.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ilan, and thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. An absolute pleasure. I hope to get back to campus soon, and maybe I'll come to one of your classes. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Good night.